Let's get some more perspective on this now. Joining us is Middle East analyst at the Israeli Citizen Spokesperson's Office, Daniel Rubenstein. Daniel joins us from Israel. Daniel, it's great to have you on the program. So Syrians around the world have been rejoicing at the eviction of the Syrian president, many now returning to the country or making plans to return to the country. Would that be a wise move to make now, shortly after the takeover?
Thank you for having me. I share the joy of the Syrian people around the world who have seen the fall of the Assad regime. This is a family dictatorship that has ruled Syria since the early 1970s. And Syria has been a key part of Iran's axis of terror that has been attacking Israel, the country where I'm sitting, for the past 14 months. Iran has been attacking Israel on 7 different fronts, from Gaza, from Lebanon, from the West Bank, from Syria, from militias in Iraq, from Yemen, and the Iranian regime itself. So it's a good thing that the Assad regime can no longer play this role of Iran's frontline position against Israel. However, what Israel is concerned about is that the main rebel organization that is now running the country of Syria, HTS, is a prescribed terrorist organization by the United States State Department, by the UK, and it is comprised of factions that are offshoots of Al-Qaeda. So that is a cause for enormous concern that you may have people who were supportive of the 9/11 attacks, who want to destroy Israel, who are now governing Syria. It remains very unclear, and Israel must be very cautious about its new neighbors. But the bottom line is that Israel wants peace with Syria. It wants peace with all of its neighbors. And we hope that the people of Syria and the government of Syria will choose to live in peace side by side with Israel.
But for the Syrians who are living outside of Syria, those who've been displaced by this war, the conflicts going on in their country, and now that has ended, the rebels are taken over. I understand, the Israeli concerns about, this rebel group that has taken over. It is still a terrorist organization labeled by the United States. But for Syrians who decide to return home, those who are already returning home, is it a wise move for them to return back to Syria so soon after the Assad government takeover?
Well, I'm not in a position to decide what's best for the people of Syria, but I very much hope the best for them and all of the Syrian people who became refugees as a result of the horrible war that the dictator Bashar al-Assad waged on his own people. I hope that those refugees, those Syrians living around the world, can come back, rebuild their country, and create a better future for themselves, for their children, for their grandchildren, a future that is a future of peace and prosperity and hope, and not one of war against its neighbors. That is my fervent wish for the Syrian people. We should be living side by side in peace as good neighbors, everyone in the Middle East.
So I take it that Israel, of course, does not trust the HTS because it's still a terrorist organization. Israel has been carrying out attacks in Syria. Now it's been accused by those Arab countries of invading the demilitarized zone. What do you make of this?
Yes, I'll tell you what happened after the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Some armed groups in Syria entered a buffer zone that has existed between Israel and Syria since the early 1970s. They entered this buffer zone and they attacked UN peacekeepers in this buffer zone. So in response to this, the Israeli military entered the buffer zone in order to defend the UN peacekeepers and keep these armed groups away from the people of Israel, away from our borders. Until we find out exactly what's going on the other side in Syria, we cannot sit and wait for armed groups to approach our borders, especially at a time when we're already at war on 6 other fronts. Now, at the same time, the Assad regime had a massive military arsenal of ships, of planes, and of chemical weapons. Assad used chemical weapons on the Syrian people, and these stockpiles of chemical weapons and other dangerous weapons are sitting in military bases, in warehouses, after the fall of the Assad regime. So Israel has taken steps to make sure that the world's most dangerous weapons do not fall into the hands of what may be some very dangerous armed groups.
But wouldn't that be an incursion on Syrian territory, which is what these Arab countries are concerned about? The fact that Israel already, invaded Lebanon, with those attacks against Hezbollah. They did the same thing in Gaza, going after Hamas. They're afraid that Syria could turn out just like these two other places. With the attacks going on, some people might get caught in the crossfire. There will be destruction of infrastructure and all of that. That's the concern here, I believe.
Yes, so there are some differences. On the Gaza front, on October 7th of 2023, the Hamas terrorist army invaded Israel with 3,000 men and massacred 1,200 people living in villages inside Israel. And in response to this, Israel began a military operation to remove Hamas from power and to make sure that it can never threaten Israel again. Now, on Israel's northern border in Lebanon, Hezbollah was there watching, and they decided to open a second front against Israel one day after October 7th. So Hezbollah saw what Hamas did in Gaza and decided to open a second front against Israel one day later. They fired thousands of rockets, missiles, guided anti-tank missiles, suicide drones. And in response to Hezbollah refusing to stop these attacks inside Israel, Israel was forced to enter Lebanon in order to push Hezbollah farther away. Now, the situation in Syria, I will call it a common sense incursion. We are surrounded by groups who are calling for our destruction. These groups are approaching our border. They are opening fire. So in response, Israel is going to defend itself before we get to a situation that is much like what happened on October 7th with Hamas or October 8th with Hezbollah. We're not going to return to a reality that existed before Iran and its proxies around us decided to open war against us.
The only country, I think, in the Middle East that's quite unhappy with the HTS takeover is Iran. We've heard the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei also talk about it. He's condemned, he's blamed Israel and the United States for the toppling of the Assad government. We do know that it's because of Israel's activities in Gaza and in Lebanon that helped to weaken the Assad government and some of those other rebel groups in Syria, leading to the Assad, to the toppling of the Assad government. But you see Iran saying things like, blaming countries like the United States and also blaming Israel. Its fear, I believe, is that, Israel wins this war. And I know that Iran still has it in for Israel's destruction. But with Hamas and Hezbollah powers already decimated, where do you think that leaves Iran?
It leaves Iran in a very vulnerable position because Iran spent vast sums of money. It stole this money from the Iranian people and decided to spend this money on supporting terrorist groups on Israel's border, such as Hamas, such as Hezbollah, further away, the Houthis in Yemen. Iran spent vast sums of money arming these groups that attacked Israel. And so in response to these attacks, Israel has defended itself against these groups and has dramatically reduced the power of these groups. And that has thus reduced the power of the Iranian regime. And of course, you saw what is happening in Syria, where these groups that once feared Iran or feared Hezbollah in Lebanon, you have to remember in the civil war in Lebanon, Hezbollah came from Lebanon, in the civil war in Syria, Hezbollah came from Lebanon and entered Syria on the side of Bashar al-Assad. So with Hezbollah in Lebanon weakened, Bashar al-Assad had fewer allies to support him. So I would say it's a very good thing if the supreme leader of Iran is upset. What I recommend that he does is begin to live in peace with all of Iran's neighbors and also live in peace with the Iranian people who they have been suppressing and oppressing for decades.
I don't think anyone saw what happened in Syria coming, quite unusual, happening years after the Arab Spring in 2011. I think the Assad government is one of the strongest to have survived that period of time. Do you think possibly, the message by the HTS leader in the mosque on Sunday after Assad fled the country, I mean, his message was also targeted to, the rest of the Arab world, saying that for those who have oppressed their people, they have it coming for them. Do you think that the people of Iran could perhaps take a cue from what's happening in Syria and do the same? Do you see the influence of the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei dwindling in Iran and eventually being toppled?
The short answer is yes. It's only a matter of timing. And as you said, the timing of the fall of Assad was surprising because the uprising against Assad started in 2011. It was a brutal civil war where about half of Syria became refugees, 500,000 killed, and it seemed like that with the help of Russia and with Iran, that Bashar al-Assad had won his civil war and he would remain in power. What changed was the October 7th massacre carried out by Hamas, which set a chain reaction of events from Iran and its proxies. They entered a war against Israel, and they have been hit very hard in this war. And I am sure that the Iranian people are watching, the Iranian people who dream of a better life, of freedom, of peace with their neighbors, of prosperity, of a better life for their children. I think the Iranian people are seeing that their regime is weakening and are wondering if there might be a way for them to overthrow their own regime. But I would be cautious about predicting the timing and the exact catalyst. But it doesn't make sense that this Iranian regime, which is so despised by the people of Iran, can survive like this forever.
Do you think the countries like the United States and the UK and other countries in the West who said they would be watching, waiting to see the actions of the HTS, despite all that it said about wanting to relate with the outside world, trying to dissociate itself from its previous brand of being a terrorist organization? Do you think that the leaders of these countries could trust this rebel group that is almost seen as a hero in Syria?
I think the wait and see is the right approach. The future of Syria should be for the Syrian people to decide. And as soon as Syria has a government that can present itself to the outside world, then every country should relate to this new government in a way that fits the foreign policies of these various governments. So it's not just about trust, it's about seeing actions, it's about verifying. And I'm watching as closely as anyone to see what happens within Syria, to see who the power brokers will be, to see how minorities are going to be treated in Syria is a very big question. There is a Kurdish minority in Syria. There's a Druze minority in Syria. There's a Christian minority in Syria. And there's also now an Alawite minority in Syria. The Alawites are the group from which Bashar al-Assad and his father Hafez al-Assad came from. They were 10 or 12% of Syria, but they had been ruling the country since the 1970s. So now this group that was once a minority ruling the majority finds itself again on the outside, and it remains to be seen how the new rulers of Syria will treat this minority that oppressed them for decades. I can only watch and hope for the best for the people of Syria, in Syria, and all around the world.
Well, Daniel, thanks again for joining us on the program. Do stay safe as much as you can as we continue to monitor the situation in Syria.
Thank you so much for having me.